Hey all, hope all is well. It's another video in the Road to Grandmaster series, and this one I'm going to go over my round 6 game from the Xtracon Open. Now, if you followed the round 5 video, you know that I drew a very tough game with white against Grandmaster Murali Karthikeyan, and it was a really tough test because I was on the defensive from the jump, even though I had the white pieces, and I think I was kind of fortunate to get a draw in the end. But sitting on 4.5 out of 5, I was now playing really strong Grandmasters pretty much every round. And my opponent in this one was another young 20-year-old Grandmaster by the name of Aryan Tari, a Norwegian talent and also former World Junior Champion to his resume. So very talented player. And actually at the time of the video, or at the time of the game rather, he was also Norwegian national champion because, well, in part because Carlson doesn't play in his national championship, but still, 2,600 plus player. I believe at his peak he was around 2660, 2670 FIDE in his very young peak. So very much someone to be reckoned with and very tenacious player. So, and I had the black piece in this one, so it was going to be a real challenge. And I was kind of racking my brains over what to play the night before. I'd been mildly familiar with Aryan Tari and his chess already because I'd seen some of his games over the years. And I'd actually known he was a Xtracon expert. And so the Xtracon's actually an opening that I hold near and dear to my heart, but I actually thought playing the Xtracon potentially against someone who is one of the leading exponents in the world of the Xtracon would probably be a bad idea. And so I actually didn't go for it. And in this one, I actually opted for another line. Now, he also could have played d4, but I noticed he had been playing e4 for the most part, so I put most of my attention preparation-wise into e4. And, well, what do you know? On move 1, he did play e4, and I had a decision to make. What would I play? What would I do? Well, it turned out, and again, this was kind of my over-the-board inspiration, I decided to play c5. And c5 is a rare guest in my own games. I'm typically the war of attrition player, the grind it out type of player. And so you might say, well, the Sicilian is not that at all. And you're absolutely right, it isn't. But I thought that, the element of surprise would be an important feature in this game. And I figured that, he wouldn't have done work against the Sicilian the night before, so I thought this would be a good choice. So anyways, after knight f3, I decided to go knight c6, and that was the second wrinkle in my setup, my preparation, because I'd actually noticed that a lot of players that play positionally don't really love to play the main lines of the Sicilian these days, and I did note that Aryan was a positional type of chess player, and so I kind of guessed correctly, actually, that he'd probably go for the Rossolimo. And I'd seen some of his games in the Rossolimo, and it turned out he was typically going bishop b5. And so I kind of expected that here, in part because when you play d4 with white, if you play d4 after c takes d4, knight takes d4, you really give black the opportunity to choose which line he's going for. And actually, I had some ideas up my sleeve in this particular setup. Of course, there's knight f6 and e5. There's e5 right away. There's g6. There's e6. There's d6. There's queen b6. There are all these different moves in the position. And because I might employ setups like this in the future, I'm going to actually leave it up to your imagination to guess what my move would have been here after knight takes d4, because that wasn't actually played. Anyways, bishop b5 was played, and this is actually extremely topical stuff, the Rossolimo. The idea is that in many of the lines, black is going to get double pawns, and in return, he's going to get the 2 bishops. So typically the line goes g6. It's the most popular way to play is g6. Bishop takes c6, and actually d takes c6. Kind of strange capturing away from the center, but it's in order for black to have good control over the d4 square. And typically here, white tends to set up with d3 and bishop e3. And, well, the setup is extremely popular. You can just go ahead and look at Fabiano Caruana's games with white, or even Magnus Carlsen's games with black to get a sense of what the setup looks like. Danil Dubov, actually, the young Russian talent that's a second of Magnus Carlsen during the World Championship match, actually tends to favor the move B takes C6, which is another dynamic way to play. Essentially, you're capturing towards the center and giving yourself the half-open B file, and it's another interesting way to play, but you're lacking control over D4, so typically white winds up going D4 and taking a lot of space in the middle. But that's another way to play. I also should say, after bishop b5, there's also e6 as an option. This line has, not been so popular for a while, because after bishop takes c6, b takes c6, typically black tends to have some trouble on the dark squares, in particular with e5 and d6. And this is after a move like castles and d5. A lot of times after d3, again, these dark squares, in particular this double pawns, allow white some potential targets. But I didn't play any of those moves. I didn't play e6 or g6. Instead, I played the move d6. And this move is not super popular, actually. It's definitely the second or third choice for the Ross-Limo lines. But, yeah, I thought it was quite playable. And the idea here is, you might say, well, what about bishop takes c6 here? Well, it is playable, bishop takes c6, b takes c6. But here the double pawns aren't as, questionable as they are in other setups, because, for instance, if white castles right away, black can actually play e5 and clamp down on the d4 square. And because black has control over the center in this particular setup, and is clamped down the square, the double pawns here aren't such a weakness. And note that the c6 pawn does a great job of covering the d5 square, which is usually a square that's a target for white's pieces in the Sicilian. So basically, white players don't really take on c6 very much in this position, because the double pawns here aren't as awkward. So anyways, after d6, white castled. This is the most popular move, and I elected to play bishop d7. And the point is now I'm putting my bishop on d7, essentially reinforcing the knight on c6, and I would plan to recapture on c6 with the bishop if he decides to take. There are many, many moves in this position. The main ones are d4, c3, and rook e1. Just to give you a little bit of a taste of each move, if d4 is played, black is pretty much obliged to capture, because d5 taking more space is a threat. And after c takes d4, knight takes d4, and knight f6, black gets a tempo on e4 and hustles to develop his kingside, typically with the kingside fianchetto. So after knight c3, g6, the bishop comes to g7, black castles, and white has, yes, a space advantage in the center, but black is also quite solid. Another way to play is c3, and the idea here is that white tries to, maintain control of the center by recapturing on d4 with a pawn. But the issue with c3 is that the pawn on e4 remains unprotected, so black can play knight f6 again, and note that knight c3 is no longer possible to defend it. So white pretty much can go d4 and sack that pawn, actually, and after knight takes e4, d5 can actually kind of argue that in this particular position, he has a lead in development, more space, and that's, compensation for the pawn, although black has a satisfactory position here as well, although it is quite complicated. And also, I should mention, queen takes d7 is also an option here. So yeah, those are, some of the options in this position, but the one that Aryan decided to play is rook e1. And this one actually is the most flexible option, because you keep d4 and c3 open as options, and you also ensure that the bishop has a useful square to escape to if it's actually harassed. And I actually do that right away by first starting knight f6, attacking the pawn, and after c3, which entertains d4 as a break, I actually went a6. And the point is that I'm trying to expand on the queen side. So if bishop a4, I can actually play b5, and almost like a Ruy Lopez Chigorin variation, I actually can, if the bishop backs up, I actually can play e5 and play this type of Chigorin setup if I want. Or I can actually go bishop g4 and dart my bishop outside of the pawn chain now that the bishop is no longer exerting pressure on this diagonal. So there are a few different ways to play. But after a6, Aryan played the move that is played the most and is most typical given the rook e1 move, and it's actually bishop f1. And the idea here is that the bishop is quite decent on this diagonal. It's tucked away, it's secured, and bishops tucked away tend to be pretty decent later in the game. So, because they're difficult to challenge, right? The bishop on f1 is not going to be challenged by any pieces for a while, and may actually find purpose as a fianchettoed bishop later, possibly. So, very, very reasonable. And after bishop f1, now that the bishop is off of this diagonal, done harassing my knight, I actually try to go bishop g4. And the idea here is that I try to discourage the d4 break a little bit more now that I have this pin on the f3 knight. And I get my bishop outside the chain before I play e5 or e6. Now, white does have many, many options here. One of the options actually is to play d4 anyway. And this is actually a very, very critical test. It did not happen in the game. But the point is that if I play a move like bishop takes f3, white can actually play g takes f3 and argue that the center is actually more significant than the double pawns. And in this position, white is actually supposed to have a very slight advantage based upon e5 or d5 being a very legitimate threat to push the pawns. One game that kind of illustrates the merits of this line for white is actually a game Peter Svidler played in the first round of the 2019 World Cup. So if you want to, kind of try and check out a game in the system, definitely head there. But I'll say that one of the interesting moves in this system after g takes f3 is actually the move g5, believe it or not. And the idea is to kind of fix these pawns on as weaknesses and kind of fix them before the dark squares and actually try to take some space on the king side. Note that bishop takes g5 is now inadvisable because rook g8 is a pin and would pick up a piece. And if a move like d5 is played now, well, knight e5, after knight e5, black has pretty good control of the dark squares, even though he doesn't have the bishop pair. So the idea here is that his dark square control kind of is sufficient. So that's one way to play, is actually bishop takes f3, g takes f3. Another way for black to play after d4 would be to first take on d4, and after c takes d4, actually go e5. And the idea here is that, black's essentially trying to challenge the pawn multiple times, given the fact that the queen's not going to recapture an f3, the g pawn would recapture. And there's been some games with bishop e3, d takes e5, e takes d4, bishop takes d4, and knight takes d4, and white's supposed to have a slight advantage here based upon the space in the middle of the board and the lead in development. So, yeah, there are basically some interesting lines here that are connected with d4, but this would be the sharper option, and again, my opponent, Aryan, is, I would say, more of a positional player than a sharp tactical player. Now, another way to play the position would actually just be to play d3, which is a little bit more modest, bit more of a modest setup, and would give black the option of actually going e5 himself or even going e6. But in some of these lines, the bishop will actually have to give itself up for the knight on f3, and yeah, these structures are, white would probably have a slight edge based upon the two bishops. And anyways, essentially, Aryan decided to start with h3, and we got a very similar position, because after h3, he's actually kind of forcing the exchange of bishop for knight right away, because bishop h5 is very risky. If I went for this, g4 is actually a legitimate idea, and g4 in conjunction with d4 could be quite dangerous for me, because I might be overrun in the center before I actually get castled. So after h3, it's kind of understood that I'm going to part with the bishop pair, and I did that by playing bishop takes f3. And now there's no need to play g takes f3 because the pawn's not on d4, so queen takes f3 is very logical. And yeah, so what the contours of the position have kind of been set in some ways, because essentially I've controlling the d4 square for now, but white has the two bishops, and theoretically can, press because he's slightly better with that long-term asset. Although I do have good coverage of the center right now, particularly on the dark squares. So after queen takes f3, black has two choices as far as how to play the position. One is to play g6, and the other is to play e6. Now, if g6 is played, of course I'm fianchettoing my bishop and kind of playing on the dark squares even more. And again, d4 is not really possible right now because I have two pieces on it. So d3 would probably be played. And after bishop g7, bishop e3, and castles, white is better here, but d4 is kind of tricky to negotiate because as soon as you play d4, you're actually opening up the diagonal for my bishop on g7. So it actually might be a little bit better for white to not rush to play d4 and instead maybe develop with knight a3 or queen d1, knight d2, f3, and essentially hold back a little bit on opening up the center for my bishop. But white would have a slightly better position here. Instead, I actually elected for the other option, which is to play e6. And the reason I preferred this option is because I've parted with the light-squared bishop. I actually think it's quite reasonable to position some of my pawns on light squares to kind of blunt the scope of the light-squared bishop on any long diagonals. So the point is with e6, the a2 f7 diagonal that leads to my king is not open, and I think that's kind of important given the bishop on f1. Note that, of course, a6 has already shut down another diagonal for this bishop. Excuse me, my diagonals are drawn funny, but you can see here that a6 controls one diagonal. Now e6, I thought, theoretically might restrict white on another diagonal, and my thought process was I want to kind of limit the scope of that light-scored bishop, so even in endings where white has the two bishops, it might not be a huge deal. So after e6, white played d3, which is, again, fairly logical given that d4 is not on the cards just yet. And now I just went bishop e7, really with the intent to castle, just develop my pieces, castle quickly. And I think, black has a relatively stable position. I can consider going queen c7 and connecting my rooks later. I can consider going b5, b4, advancing on the queen side. And I might even consider d5, challenging the e4 pawn before he's really able to play d4, because I think some of these closed structures might be decent for black. These closed French structures after d5 and e5, if my knight comes to d7, both my knights might be eyeing the e5 pawn, and the bishop might not be as significant a strength in a closed position. So that's kind of the things that I was thinking about. But now Aryan played kind of a strange move for me with the move bishop f4. And the reason I thought this was a little bit strange is because it didn't really advance the notion of d4. I thought that it would be more sensible to play a move like queen e2 or even knight d2, with the idea basically to transfer this knight to the f3 square and then facilitate the d4 break. So bishop f4 is a little bit puzzling to me because I just didn't see the point of the bishop being on this diagonal right now. I thought my knight can always jump to e5 and kind of block it. And I just didn't think it was consistent with a plan of white playing d4 because now it hasn't contributed to that push. So I actually stopped here and thought for a moment with bishop f4 because my original intention was to just castle no matter what. And when I saw bishop f4, I was like, well, do I have time to do something else? Is there something else in the position that I can actually take advantage of, the fact that he's kind of played this little kind of strange-looking move order to me? And I started to look at the position, and I spent, 5 minutes and then 10 minutes. And then I actually landed on a very, very interesting idea that was completely over-the-board inspiration and looks kind of wacko, to be honest, but I was actually inspired by a game I saw in the World Championship candidates. Excuse me, not the World Championship, in the candidates tournament. I think it was the 2016 candidates tournament where Kramnik was actually black against Aryan in a Berlin, a closed Berlin of all openings, Ruy Lopez Berlin, and it was this move rook g8. And this is actually what I played. And the idea with rook g8 was that because white has created a hook with h3, and now this bishop is kind of also a hook with f4, I actually get a few tempe to execute g5, g4. And I thought that, prying open the g file, coupled with my counterplay on the dark squares, would be really dangerous for white to deal with. And it's so funny to me because if any other move besides bishop f4 is played, rook g8 would not have been a consideration. It really wouldn't. It would not have been a move I'd played. But given the nature of this bishop f4, I thought, wow, I should probably go for this. And it would certainly be something that he, hadn't seen and would have to contend with. And in addition to all those factors, I also knew that Aryan is a positional player, and all of a sudden, he'd have to deal with the discomfort of actually being attacked. So I thought there was also psychology on my side, and I decided to go for it. Now, amazingly, just goes to show you how much chess has been played in the history of our game. Rook g8 has actually been played once before in 2016. I thought I was, the Mr. Original, but actually turns out it had been played before, and I believe that game was a draw, but I don't recall exactly, but it hasn't played before, and I thought that was even remarkable that this had been played before because it looks so strange. But it's also kind of funny because if you compare this game to my game a few rounds earlier against Moisenko, in both games h3 was a hook for which I could use as a kind of lever for my attack. And I already thought there might be some good prospects here. So anyways, after rook g8, white actually played bishop e3, kind of stepping out of the way of g5 with tempo, and actually acknowledging that g5 is kind of an interesting idea here. But I think this is already a mistake. Instead, the kind of unnatural-looking queen e3 would be a little bit better because now g5 is just discouraged. So instead, I'd probably go for d5. And now the point is that if queen e2 is played, now g5 would be playable, but the bishop can actually stay on the diagonal and actually help in the defense of the white king. Whereas in playing bishop e3, the bishop is not really helping in the defense of the king right now. And furthermore, when I play g5 and g4, which I will play, my knight might come into the game and challenge that bishop on e3. So I just don't think it's the right square for it. But anyways, after bishop e3, I went g5, and this was also the reason I went for this line was because I noticed that I'm also challenging the queen on f3 after I played g4. So given the fact that some of these moves are coming with tempo, it gave me more confidence that that the idea was legit because it's not like white has a lot of time to do other things. It's coming very quickly. So after g5, white actually went d4, trying to kind of play through the middle. The old tenet is if someone's playing on the flank, you play through the center, and Aryan's basically staying with that idea. Instead, knight d2 would have probably been a little bit better. Now, it's not a huge difference, but the point is white continues to develop and gets a knight closer to the action. And after g4, h takes g4, knight takes g4, and queen h3, white is actually, kind of trying to fight here, hold off the attack a little bit. Although black is a totally satisfactory position here. And I would probably go knight takes e3. And if rook takes e3, bishop g5. And I really, really like black's prospects here. Note that the rook and the knight are skewered presently. And if rook g3, I just go queen f6. And I'm not so concerned about the h7 pawn because I have such great control over the dark squares that's really where my counterplay is lying. And the pawn is not so significant. The other thing is if queen takes h7, the h file also opens up and it's a source of counterplay for me. And so actually rook h8 actually wins material right away because of the queen's actually trapped. But even if the queen wasn't trapped, I can just castle queenside very quickly and get on with my attack. So, I think black has very, very active play here. Instead, though, d4 was played, and this gives me an opportunity to pry open the position further, and so I went g4, not really concerned about d5 or d takes e5 because I thought my knight would come to e5. So anyways, after g4, h takes g4, knight takes g4. Now, all of a sudden, I'm hitting this bishop. I'm probably going to get rid of this dark square bishop. If it moves, I have bishop g5 in some lines, exchanging that way. And just have a ton of counterplay here. And my king is actually quite snug on e8. So, my e6 and f7 pawns are doing just fine, keeping my king secure on e8. After knight takes g4, Aryan played knight d2, now, essentially trying to develop. And I went knight takes e3, taking that very important dark squared bishop. And after queen takes e3, the position is actually very, very critical because all of a sudden, black is extremely weak on the dark squares. d4 is a little bit sensitive. White's hanging on to it by a thread. f4 is a little sensitive. g5 is sensitive. And to take advantage of this, I actually went for bishop g5. And amazingly, white's actually in pretty serious trouble here. Now, it actually turns out that queen d3 still gives white a quite satisfactory position, but even here, black is actually quite okay in endgames now, given the control that I have over the dark squares, and I can actually begin an exchanging operation with bishop takes d2, queen takes d2, cd4, cd4, and e5. And the point is that, my rook's active on the g file, and now my knight actually will get access to the d4 square. So after d takes e5, d takes e5, knight d4 is actually quite legit. And you can see from d4, knight f3 check becomes an idea as well. And so white probably should consider trading queens with queen d8, rook d8. But even here, after a move like rook c1, threatening bishop takes a6, I have rook g6, and again, with my knight coming to d4 here, the endgames really should be quite okay for me. So, yeah, black has really, really good control of the dark squares, and white has to be extremely alert. After the move bishop g5, though, Aryan made what should have been a losing mistake with the move f4. And unfortunately, this move is just too much as far as the dark squares are concerned. There are just too many weaknesses in the position to go for this. With the move f4, g3 is weakened a little bit. This whole diagonal is sensitive. And because of that, I thought that it would make sense to put my bishop on h4 and take advantage of those dark squares. But unfortunately for me, I missed a way, way better move that is just nearly decisive. So why don't you pause the video and try to figure out what the move here is for black. All right, hopefully you got a chance to pause the video and mull the correct continuation. It turns out here the move that really would put black seriously in the driver's seat and put white in serious difficulties is actually the move bishop h6. And the issue for white here is that this queen is tied down to two critical points, the d4 and f4 pawn. And really, the dark squares are too sensitive, and black is actually threatening rook g4 and queen h4, ganging up on the f4 pawn. And given the nature of the open g file, white's king is just too weak, and the pawn on g2 is unable to really support the f4 pawn. And so let me show you a few examples. If d takes d5 is played, right, that seems like it might be a move to resolve some of the tension here. I actually now can play the move knight e5, amazingly. And the issue here is that the pawn f4 is just pinned because the queen on e3 is there. So after knight e5, I'm actually threatening knight g4, encroaching on the position even further. And that, and in conjunction with queen h4, is just too much. So if c takes d6, knight g4, queen d4 is necessary because if you move the queen off of this square, now I have queen b6 check and nasty threats on that diagonal. So queen d4, and now I can just play bishop takes f4. And even though, the material's equal right now, the position's about to collapse. D6 is hanging. Bishop H2 check is a threat. Queen H4 is a threat. And if they're knight F3, I can actually just take on D6. And this type of endgame is just absolutely terrible because the bishop on F1 won't really have a meaningful diagonal because these pawns block out this one. This pawn blocks out this one. And my ability to just blockade and just play on the dark squares here is just too much. So bishop c5 check is huge. Knight e5 is also an option. It's just too much for white to handle. So that's one line. Now is d takes e5. Let's say rook a d1 is played. Well, now after c takes d4, c takes d4, rook g4 is the other problem, and you can see f4 is just dropping. There's no way to defend it again because g3 just runs into bishop takes f4 anyway because the pawn would be pinned. And so the best move would be queen e2, but after rook takes f4, this is already a massive edge for black. d4 is also hanging. I also have the queen potentially coming into one of these squares, and d5 doesn't really change very much. I can either put the knight on d4 and anchor it there, or I can even go knight e5, and those are both huge problems. In fact, even queen b6 check is a huge idea as well, because if queen b6, queen e3, rook takes f1 is decisive. So that doesn't work either. If knight f3, trying to guard the h4 square right away, reinforce d4, again, c takes d4, c takes d4, and now queen f6, hammering away at the f4 square in that way, and the pawn just drops. And if e5, I can take on e5 first, and then take on f4. And the issue is, when the queens come off the board, e5 is still a target. And so, again, just a close to winning position for black. And so, basically, the dark squares are just so weak that f4 is actually not a possibility. And just by holding back with bishop h6 here, there's just not really much white can do to deal with the threats. And it's quite disappointing that I missed this because I was actually looking at this move and I thought after d5, knight e5, that there might be some problems for me. But it actually turns out that in this version, if d takes e6, amazingly here, I have the move queen h4. And this is the other idea that's just incredible to me, is actually that after e takes f7 check, king takes f7, there's still massive threats here based upon the control of the dark squares. And yeah, these are basically just some things that I overlooked. So anyways, instead of that really nice sequence, I went for bishop h4. And my idea here was that I'm hitting the e1 rook, that, white would have to waste a tempo, dealing with this rook, and then I could actually anchor myself on g3 and have still excellent control of the dark squares. There's some ideas with bishop g3 and queen h4, and I thought, okay, this was really good pressure here. But actually, as soon as I played bishop h4, I realized what I'd actually allowed, and that I actually handed over the initiative to white. And I could not believe what I'd done, because I'd realized that this move that he was going to the move that he could play and that he wound up playing was an option. And it was actually the move d5. And it's a move that should be so clear and obvious, in my calculation. It's like, why didn't I see this before I made the move? Because it's so clear. I was looking at d5 as an option with the bishop on h6. Why did I ignore it with the bishop on h4? Very, very strange. And frankly, the issue for me right now is that now the knight on c6 is, harassed, and taking the exchange with bishop e1 would just be losing, because if I play bishop e1 after rook takes e1, the pressure here is too great on the e-file, and frankly, I would lose some of the dark square control that gave me initiative against the white king. So now that I'd be pushed back, this would just not be a great position. Another one of the problems is that the c4 square is now ripe and tender for either the knight on d2 or the bishop on c4 to occupy it. So I thought that, like, if I played a move like knight e7, well, a move like knight c4 or even d takes e6, f takes e6, and bishop c4 would enable white to just crash through. And so it dawned on me here that I can't even rush to take the exchange because, well, I could, but I'd have to just be wary of, this d5 move and the consequences after it. So after d5, I actually played e takes d5. And my idea here was to try and set up a blockade on the dark squares because I knew my king was no longer going to castle. It was going to be stuck at the center. And I thought my only hope was to try and hold firm with knight e7 and just kind of try to defend on the dark squares. So after e takes d5, I went knight e7. And now white went queen h3. And you can see here that, again, the initiative has shifted to white because Aryan's basically giving up an exchange, willing to give up an exchange to keep this attack going and to keep my king in the center. Note that as long as the queen's on this diagonal, my king is not going anywhere. So after queen h3, I played bishop takes e1. And now the second phase of his plan was initiated because he played the move knight e4. And this is a move that's extremely strong and something that I'd actually had missed in my calculation. I thought that he was going to just recapture on e1, and I actually thought I would hold this one, to be honest. I thought I'd had queen d7 now, challenging the queen on h3. And after the queen moved, I thought to h4 to try and keep the pin on put the pressure on the e7 knight and ensure I don't castle. I'd actually have to play king f8 and step out the way. And, I figured in a position like this, white would still have the pressure on, but I'd probably be able to hold this one. My knight and my rook are doing a decent job of, covering some squares around my king. And my queen is, close enough to the king side that I can try and force a queen trade here. And it actually turns out this position is equal with best play, but very, very scary to defend. Instead, Aryan made it even scarier to defend with his move knight e4, because all of a sudden knight f6 check is a massive threat. And even though he's a rook down, this bishop on e1 is actually going to be lost anyway. There's no square I can go to where it's not secure, or where it's not hanging. So where it's going to be unsecure every single time. So anyways, after knight e4, I realized my bishop on e1 was lost. And so I thought, why don't I try and get something for it? And that's why I played the move bishop g3. And my idea with bishop g3 was actually to distract this knight, hopefully, from the f6 square, and also to prevent the rook from coming to e1 with decisive effect. So my thought process was that if I'm able to get rid of this knight, even if it's at the cost of 2 pieces, I might retain some dark square control again in the position. And that was my idea with bishop g3, while preventing the rook from coming to e1. It actually turns out that bishop takes c3 is also very playable and arguably slightly better. And the point is that after b takes c3, I've actually won a pawn, at least for my troubles, and can now go knight g6 and cover up the f6 square. The line would continue rook e1, king f8, knight g5, rook g7, knight h7 check, rook takes, and queen f6. And it turns out here that I'm actually, okay. The position here, now the material's actually equal. And again, I managed to retain that dark square control I was talking about. Note the rook can't enter because the knight is holding the e7 square. So, black could kind of hold this one as well. The other thing I want to point out that in many lines you might consider queen h6 check, rook g7, and f5 as an option, threatening f6. But it's always very important that in a lot of these positions with f5, I can actually go queen h4 and actually force off the trade of queens and retain my exchange. So this would be a type of position where all of a sudden black would actually be winning. So anyways, I did go bishop g3. And after bishop g3, knight f6 check was played. So Aryan basically decided not to take the bishop because it slowed down his initiative and allowed me to go queen d7, and decided it was more important to, play this way. I went king f8. Basically, that's an only move. And now queen h6 check was played, challenging my king again. And again, I only have one move, rook g7. And now knight takes h7 check was played, and I have another only move because I went king g8. Again, if I go king e8, then queen takes g7 just wins the rook and actually threatens mate on f6. So after knight h7 check, I went king g8, knight f6 check, king f8, knight h7 check, king g8, and it appeared that my opponent actually was going to be satisfied with a draw, but then he actually threw in bishop d3. And here I had to think, oh man, he's adding more fuel to the fire. Does this make a huge difference? Are there threats in this position I should contend with? And I thought for a while, and I thought, yeah, with bishop d3, now there might be some ideas of the bishop getting involved in the game and taking away some squares from me. And so I decided to play bishop takes f4. And my idea here was to desperately get the queen off of the pin of this king on f8 and this rook on g7 so that I can free up my own position. But after bishop takes f4, now Aryan went back to the checks, and we actually wound up agreeing to a draw after knight h7 check. Now, white could try to continue the game with a move like queen takes f4, and so he gets a piece back, and he's only down the exchange here. But again, as soon as the queen leaves the pin, I actually can go knight g6. And this actually frees up my game because it actually attacks the queen with tempo and prevents it from going back to h6 because the f6 knight would be hanging. And so this type of position is actually quite okay for black. The game could continue queen g5, holding the knight and f6 together. But now I can actually throw in c4 as a very important move, dislodging the bishop from this diagonal and entertaining queen b6 check and some counterplay of my own. And I think this type of position, he just didn't want to, play this one out because all of a sudden black is getting quite active and there's no clear and pressing danger as far as checkmate is concerned. Although there's still these repetitions whenever white wants it with knight h7 and knight f6 check. So after this repetition, we kind of agreed to a draw here. And it was a really tough game, I must say. Just to defend this attack that seemed to come out of nowhere was quite disappointing in some respects because I'd had a real initiative. And I felt like I'd let one get away because I did have this real pressure along the g-file with my rook and all this great control of the dark squares. That being said, a draw with black against a 2600 player is huge, and it kept my, the good story and the good vibes in my tournament going. So even though I might have been winning for one move, the fact that I was never losing, that I actually did defend reasonably when under fire, meant that it was a pretty well-played game that I should be relatively satisfied with. So now it meant, I was on 5 out of 6, 4 wins and 2 draws, and on to the next. All right, that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Please like and or subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, you could do so by making a donation through the PayPal link in the description below. Thanks again. Take care.